Meet the inmates the FBI calls too violent to ever release. The door slammed shut so hard that the concrete walls shook. Four officers stood frozen, staring through the thick glass window as the inmate inside the cage-paced cell slammed his fists against the steel, over and over, until blood marked the walls. This was the moment the FBI later described as a human being acting like a storm you cannot control. Inside the federal Supermax, they called him one of the inmates too violent to ever release. A man the FBI said could turn an ordinary moment into chaos in seconds. And on this night he had snapped without warning. He grabbed the metal stool bolted to the floor, yanking with such rage that the screws screeched and began to twist loose. The officers shouted for backup as alarms echoed through the block. Still he didn't stop. The stool finally tore free, crashing against the concrete. He lifted it again, eyes wide, heart racing, every breath fueled by something dark and uncontrollable. And just as he raised the heavy stool toward the observation glass, the exact moment the FBI would later point to and say, "This is why he can never be released," the screen cuts to black. That's where the story pauses, leaving a single question hanging in the air. What pushed him to that breaking point? Now we go back, to the very beginning. He had arrived at the Supermax years earlier, shackled from wrist to ankle, escorted by a team of U.S. Marshals who refused to remove his restraints until he was locked down inside the cell built specifically for him. They said he had a history of explosive violence, quick, unpredictable, and terrifying to everyone around him. His first weeks inside were strangely quiet. He barely spoke, following orders, eating the small meals slid through the slot, pacing the same 10 steps back and forth for hours at a time. Some guards even thought the stories about him were exaggerated. But the calm didn't last. One morning, without warning, he flipped his metal food tray and smashed it repeatedly against the door, shouting until the entire tier fell silent. The banging echoed across the concrete like someone striking a drum in a cave. Officers rushed in riot gear, yelling commands he ignored. Later that afternoon he sat quietly again, arms folded, breathing slow, as if nothing had happened. This was the part of his personality that made officers uneasy. He could go from stillness to explosion in seconds. Days later, another incident began with something small, a guard speaking too loudly near his cell. The inmates stared at him with cold, unblinking focus. He stepped back into the shadows, waiting, breathing deep. The officers checking the cameras noticed the tension building but didn't know why. Then, slowly he approached the food slot. He didn't shout. He didn't make threats. He simply waited. And when the guard stepped close, just close enough, that's when everything shifted. The inmate's hand shot through the small gap with terrifying speed, grabbing the guard's forearm with a grip so tight the officer yelled out in shock. Officers scrambled, alarms blared, and chaos exploded inside the tier. This was another moment the FBI would later mark in their file as high-risk behavior, violent without provocation. As the emergency team raced down the hallway and the officer struggled to free himself, the inmate tightened his grip, pulling harder. And that's where Chapter 1 ends, on an extreme event, with the inmate dragging the guard closer through the slot, and everyone realizing, this man wasn't just dangerous. He was exactly what the FBI feared. Too violent to ever release. The hallway thundered with boots as the emergency response team charged toward the cell. The trapped officer shouted in pain, his arm twisted at an angle it was never meant to bend. The inmate's eyes were locked on him, cold, focused, and disturbingly calm even as alarms blared. But just as two riot officers reached the door, the inmate suddenly released his grip. The officer fell backward, clutching his arm, breathing hard. Everyone expected the inmate to start screaming or throwing things, but instead, he stepped quietly back into the center of his cell. He stood still, staring at the wall like nothing had just happened. This was the strange low that made him impossible to predict. He didn't resist when they ordered him to lie down. He just stared at the ceiling while the riot team cuffed him, checked the cell, and then locked him back inside. Minutes later, he was sitting on the cement bed, calm again, breathing slow, eyes empty. But the FBI file grew thicker. Every outburst, every sudden shift, every violent moment was documented in red ink. 2 weeks passed with no major incidents. The guards relaxed a little, only a little, but enough to believe he might finally be settling down. He walked his tight circles. He ate his meals. He listened to the sounds of doors clanging open on other tiers. But inside his mind, something else was building. It started with small things that no one noticed. Him staring longer at the cameras, pacing faster, stopping suddenly as if he heard something that wasn't there. The prison psychologist described it as pressure building beneath the surface. Then came the day that changed the entire facility. was laundry day. Officers pushed a cart down the tier, dropping clean clothes through the chutes. When it was his turn, the inmate walked to the back wall instead of toward the slot. The guard frowned, knocked on the door and called out to him. No response. The guard tried again. Still nothing. Finally he leaned closer to the slot. That's when the inmate moved. Fast. He rushed forward with such speed that the guard stumbled back. His eyes were wide, and for the first time, officers saw something that chilled them. He wasn't acting out of anger, he was acting out of intent. He grabbed the laundry bag, ripped it open, and pulled out the long, thin metal pin from the tag that held the clothes together. Nobody understood how he had spotted something that small. Nobody understood how he grabbed it so fast. He pressed the metal between his fingers, twisting it, bending it, sharpening it against the concrete floor. In seconds he had shaped it into a weapon. A homemade shank. The officer froze. Backup sprinted down the hallway. Radios crackled. The command center switched cameras to his cell. Inside he crouched low, the sharpened metal glinting in his hand. But he wasn't looking at the officers. He was looking at the ceiling vent. The same vent connected to 2 other high-security cells. Before anyone could process what was happening, he leaped onto the bed, shoved his hand into the vent, and started stabbing upward, fast and violently. The inmate in the cell above screamed in shock. Officers panicked. No one had ever seen someone attacked through the vent system. No one even believed it was possible. But he was doing it, striking wildly, roaring with a rage that echoed across the tier. This was the new extreme moment. Another incident the FBI later highlighted in red, writing only 5 words. He cannot be controlled. Ever. And Chapter 2 ends right here. With officers rushing toward the cell, the inmate stabbing into the vents, and the entire Supermax realizing. This wasn't random. This wasn't sudden. This was planned. And he was only getting started. Officers sprinted toward the cell, shouting commands that echoed down the concrete hallway. The inmate didn't look at them. He didn't pause. He kept striking upward into the vent, each hit louder than the last, sharp metal tapping against steel, sending vibrations through the entire tier. The inmate in the cell above yelled for help, scrambling away from the vent opening. Even though the metal couldn't reach deep enough to seriously injure him, the attack was enough to terrify everyone watching. It proved something far more dangerous. He could turn anything, no matter how small, into a weapon. The tactical team reached the door, shields up, batons ready. They expected him to turn and attack them next, but suddenly, he stopped. Just like that. He lowered the metal strip, stepped down from the bed, and sat on the concrete as if nothing had happened. His breathing slowed. His face relaxed. He placed the shank beside him like a child placing down a broken toy. The officers hesitated. No one wanted to open the door now. No one wanted to step into a cell with someone who could switch from silent to violent in seconds. The lieutenant ordered the cameras zoomed in. The inmate stared straight into the lens. No emotion, no fear, just a cold stare that made even the officers shift uncomfortably. This was the low, but this time it felt even worse than the high. After a long standoff, the tactical team stormed inside, pinned him down, cuffed him, and removed the sharp metal. He didn't fight back. He didn't speak. He just inhaled slow and deep as if saving energy for something else. The prison placed him on total lockdown. No movement. No privileges. No contact with other inmates. They hoped this would calm him. But the FBI had already been notified. His file was reviewed again. And across the top of the page someone wrote one sentence. If he can reach another inmate in a sealed cell, imagine what he'll do if ever released. For 3 weeks, everything stayed quiet. He didn't shout. He didn't pace. He didn't throw anything. He barely touched his food. Guards walked past his door slowly, waiting for another explosion, but none came. He sat on the bed most days, staring at the wall, completely still. Some officers began to think the incident in the vent was the peak. That maybe he had burned out all the rage inside him. But then, on a silent morning, something changed. A new guard, fresh from training, approached the cell. He didn't know the inmate's history. He didn't understand the warning signs written all over that thick FBI file. He treated the moment like a normal day, like a normal inmate. He walked to the door. He opened the slot. And he reached to slide in the breakfast tray. The inmate remained seated on the bed, head down, not moving. The guard relaxed his shoulders, thinking the inmate was calm. Then, without warning, the inmate lifted his head and smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not a polite smile. A slow, unnatural smile that stretched just a little too long. The guard froze. The inmate stood up. And he walked toward the slot, quietly, slowly, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. The guard stepped back, but it was already too late. The inmate lunged forward with terrifying speed, slamming both hands against the food slot, trapping the guard's fingers between metal and steel. The guard shouted in pain, trying to pull away, but the inmate pressed harder. This was the new extreme event. The alarms exploded across the block. Officers rushed toward the cell. Radios cracked with emergency codes. The lieutenant shouted for tear gas. The old-timers muttered under their breath. He's doing it again, he's flipping. And Chapter 3 ends right here. With the inmate pinning the guard's hand in the slot, refusing to let go, eyes burning with the same rage the FBI warned about, and everyone realizing. The quiet wasn't calm. It was preparation. Something much bigger was coming. The guard's scream echoed across the entire tier. Officers sprinted toward the cell, boots hammering the floor, radios blasting urgent codes. But inside the tiny concrete room, the inmate held on to the food slot with a grip so strong it seemed impossible for one person to produce. The trapped guard tried to pull away, but the metal door clamped his hand in place. His knees buckled as he shouted for help. The inmate didn't look angry this time, he looked focused. Calm. Almost calculating. That was what scared everyone most. 3 officers reached the door and began shouting commands. The inmate didn't blink. He pressed forward again, pinning the guard's hand harder. The lieutenant ordered the emergency team to get the pry bar. Another officer yelled for the camera room to record every second. The inmate slowly lifted his eyes toward the officers, still holding the slot shut with one hand. His breathing steady. His stance firm. His expression cold. Then, just like before, he simply let go. The guard fell backward, clutching his hand, gasping. The inmate stepped away from the slot and returned to the center of the cell. No shouting. No pacing. No panic. He stood there, arms by his side, staring calmly at the officers through the glass, almost as if he wanted them to see how in control he was. And that's what terrified them. The team hesitated to enter. They'd been here before. They knew the pattern. This wasn't the end of the incident. This was the reset. The quiet moment before he did something far worse. 2 officers carefully opened the cell door, shields forward. The inmate didn't move. He didn't even raise his head. They ordered him to lie on the ground. He didn't respond. They repeated the command. Still nothing. Then, slowly he lowered himself to his knees. And smiled again. That's when the lieutenant knew. He wasn't complying. He was baiting them. Before anyone could react, the inmate lunged forward, ramming his shoulder into the nearest shield. The officer stumbled, almost falling. The cell erupted into chaos, shouting, echoing footsteps, shields slamming against concrete. The tactical team surged in, trying to pin him down, but his strength was beyond what they expected. He twisted, pushing, fighting with intense bursts of energy that forced 3 grown officers backward at once. The struggle was loud, violent, and terrifying, but it wasn't random. He wasn't trying to escape. He wasn't even trying to harm them long-term. He was trying to show them something. I still control the room. It took the entire team to hold him down. They finally cuffed him, lifted him, and dragged him out of the cell. Even then he didn't shout or resist. He let them take him, body limp, head down. But the moment they reached the hallway, he suddenly jerked up, snapping his head toward an officer so fast the man jumped back. Another red note went into his FBI file. Another sentence added to the growing warning list. He displays deliberate, calculated aggression. Not impulse. Not confusion. Intention. They placed him in a restraint chair, strapped him down, and rolled him into an isolation wing where prisoners went when they became too dangerous even for Supermax standards. The hallway was silent. Only the wheels of the chair echoed against the concrete. The inmate stared straight ahead, not blinking. Not angry. Just waiting. Later that night, while the officers wrote their reports, one guard reviewing the camera footage noticed something disturbing. Before attacking the food slot, the inmate had placed his blanket in a specific corner. Before lunging at the officer, he glanced twice at the left wall camera. Before resisting the tactical team, he tested the shield distance with a tiny step forward. None of it was random. It was all planned. And just when the prison thought they had finally contained him, when they believed the restraint chair would stop every outburst, something unexpected, something extreme, happened next. A sudden scream came from the isolation wing. A scream from another inmate. Officers raced toward the sound. Lights flashed. Doors clanged open. And when they reached the room, the dangerous inmate, still fully strapped into the restraint chair, had somehow tilted the entire chair backward and smashed it against the door so hard it triggered the alarm sensors and startled the inmate next door into panic. The officers froze. If a man strapped to a chair could cause this much chaos, what would he do next? And Chapter 4 ends right here. On the moment officers realized the truth, the FBI had already written in bold letters. Restraints slow him down. They do not stop him. The alarm lights flashed red as officers hurried toward the isolation wing. The hallway echoed with fast footsteps, radio chatter, and the steady hum of locked steel doors. But the moment they reached the room, the entire team froze. The inmate, still strapped tightly into the restraint chair, had slammed the entire metal frame backward with such force that the heavy door rattled. The chair had tipped onto its rear wheels, leaning against the steel like a battering ram. The inmate wasn't shouting, wasn't twisting, wasn't fighting. He just stared ahead with that same blank expression that unnerved even the toughest officers. 2 guards rushed to lift the chair upright. They expected a struggle. But he didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't even tighten his muscles. He sat there perfectly still. This wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the look he gave the lieutenant. That quiet stare that said he knew exactly what he was doing. They repositioned the chair, checked the straps again, and cleared the hallway. The inmate next door was still breathing hard, shaken by the impact on the door. The officers warned him everything was under control, but inside they knew it wasn't. That night, after things calmed down, they placed the dangerous inmate on the highest monitoring level. 3 cameras. 2 guards assigned to watch him. Even the FBI logged the new incident. The report only had one sentence. He uses silence as a setup. Hours passed. The prison grew quieter. Some guards took their breaks. The night shift moved in. And that's when the low came. The inmate leaned his head against the back of the restraint chair, closing his eyes like he was falling asleep. His breathing slowed. His body relaxed. He looked harmless, almost fragile. The new night shift officer even whispered to his partner, "Maybe he's finally done." But the older officer on post shook his head. "He's never done. Watch him." For nearly an hour the inmate didn't move at all. Not a twitch. Not a sound. Nothing. It was the quietest they had ever seen him. Then around 2:14 a.m. the camera at the top right corner flickered. Just a small glitch. A tiny moment. Half a second. But that half second was enough. Because when the camera blinked back on, the inmate's eyes were wide open, staring directly into the lens, like he had been waiting for that exact moment. The night shift officer jumped in his seat. The inmate didn't smile. He didn't shout. He didn't strain against the straps. He just whispered one sentence, barely audible over the microphone. "Do you hear it?" Both officers stiffened. "Hear what?" the younger guard muttered. The inmate tilted his head slightly, still staring at the camera. And then, he started rocking. Slow at first. Forward, back. Forward, back. Tiny movements, but strong enough that the metal bolts on the chair complained with a soft, rhythmic creak. The older officer stood up fast. No. Shut that down. No. He's building momentum." They called the lieutenant. More officers rushed to the wing. But inside the room the inmate didn't stop rocking. He kept going, building speed, each swing a little harder than the last. Forward, back, forward. But the metal restraint strained. The chair legs scraped. The floor vibrated. And then, with a sudden violent thrust, he smashed the entire chair again into the door. This time with enough power that the steel sensor box sparked. Alarms exploded across the wing. Officers charged in immediately, shouting commands, forming a wall of shields. The entire hallway went into lockdown mode. But the inmate didn't fight. As soon as the door cracked open, he froze, completely motionless, breathing slow again, eyes half-lidded, like nothing had happened. The lieutenant looked at him with disbelief. How did he generate that much force strapped down? No one had an answer. Another red note hit his FBI file. Can weaponize restricted movement. And as the officer stepped closer to secure him again, tightening every strap one more time, the inmate slowly lifted his head, looked each officer in the eye, and whispered something that sent a chill through everyone standing there. "It's not the chair you should worry about." Then the room fell silent. And that's where Chapter 5 ends. On the moment the prison realized the truth, his violence wasn't random. His silence wasn't peace. And whatever he was planning, it wasn't finished yet. The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence after his whisper. Officers tightened every strap on the restraint chair, checking them twice, then a third time. They reinforced the arm locks, secured his wrists, checked the leg restraints, and even added an additional chest belt. He didn't resist. He didn't blink. He didn't look afraid. He just stared straight ahead as if all of this meant nothing. The lieutenant stepped back, breathing hard. Double cameras. Double guards. Nobody turns their back on him. Everyone nodded. Everyone understood. But deep down, every officer in that hallway felt something they didn't want to admit. Straps weren't stopping him. Doors weren't stopping him. Isolation wasn't stopping him. He was thinking, planning, studying every detail around him. And the prison knew it. Hours passed. The alarms were cleared. The hallway quieted again. The inmate remained strapped into the chair, motionless. A doctor came to check his vitals. Heart rate steady. Breathing normal. Muscles relaxed. He looked like a man who hadn't caused a single problem. But the FBI file told a different story. And soon the next low began. The inmate lowered his head and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed even more. He looked almost peaceful, like someone drifting into sleep. The night shift officers watched him, suspicious, but nothing happened. Minutes turned into an hour. Then 2. The younger officer leaned back and whispered, "Maybe he's just tired." The older officer didn't look away from the screens. "He's thinking. I've seen this before. This is when he's the most dangerous." And he was right. Because at 4:37 a.m., a faint clicking sound came from the restraint straps. At first it sounded like nothing, maybe the metal just settling. But then it clicked again. And again. The older guard leaned forward. "Wait. That's not the chair. That's him." He zoomed the camera in. The inmate's hands weren't moving, but his wrists were tightening, twisting in a slow pattern, back and forth, rubbing against the straps in a perfect rhythm. The guard's eyes widened. "He's weakening the leather." The lieutenant was called immediately. More officers arrived. They watched in disbelief as the inmate continued twisting, almost gently, almost calmly, wearing down the strap layer by layer. Leather didn't show much damage at first. But the rhythm was relentless. Predictable. Precise. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't fighting. He was calculating. Officers burst into the room before he could finish wearing through the strap. They resecured the restraints, added 2 more layers of reinforced bands and stepped back. Still, he didn't flinch. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He just stared at them. The warden himself came in now, something that rarely happened at this hour. He studied the inmate carefully before turning to the lieutenant. "His classification changes today. He's going under federal extreme monitoring." The lieutenant nodded. "What do we tell the FBI?" The warden exhaled slowly. "Tell them they were right. He's not trying to escape, he's testing the system." But before they could even submit the report, before the cameras could even log the next hour, something happened that shocked every officer on the tier. A loud, rapid banging echoed through the isolation hallway. Not from him. From 3 cells down. Officers ran toward the noise and found another inmate pounding on his window, yelling frantically. "He's talking. I swear to God he's talking through the vents." The officers exchanged horrified looks. Because they all knew something terrifying. He wasn't supposed to be able to communicate with anyone. Not with him restrained. Not in this wing. Not in this facility. The lieutenant rushed back to the dangerous inmate's room. The man was still strapped down. Still perfectly still. Still staring straight ahead. But then, very slowly, he turned his head toward the left wall vent. And smiled. Chapter 6 ends right here. On the moment the prison realized. He didn't need freedom to cause chaos. He didn't need movement. He didn't need weapons. He only needed his mind. And he was already using it. The moment he turned his head toward the vent and smiled, every officer in the isolation wing froze. The warden stared at the camera feed, his breath tightening in his chest. "How is he communicating?" the lieutenant muttered. No one answered. Because the truth was simple and terrifying. He wasn't supposed to have the ability. He was fully restrained. Strapped down. Under constant watch. Mouth barely able to move behind the chin strap. Yet another inmate, 3 cells away, was yelling that he heard him speaking through the vents. The warden ordered the entire wing locked down. No movement. No talking. No one leaves this hallway. Officers rushed to check every vent panel. They inspected screws, airflow ducts, audio pickups, anything that could explain what was happening. But every vent was sealed. Every screw was tight. Every panel was secured. Still, the inmate 3 cells down kept shouting. He said something. "I heard it." He said, "Listen closely," that's what he said. The guards told him he was imagining things. But the inmate shook his head violently. No, I heard him." His voice was right in the wall. The lieutenant returned to the dangerous inmate's door. The man in the chair didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't move. But his eyes, they weren't looking straight ahead anymore. They were looking at the vent. And that was enough. The warden stormed into the control room. Shut off all airflow to isolation. Now. Fans powered down. The humming vents went silent. Stillness filled the hall. But even with the vents dead, even with every sound shut off, the inmate 3 cells away whispered, "I can still hear him." Officers turned pale. Something wasn't adding up. The lieutenant walked slowly back to the restraint chair, his heart pounding. He spoke through the glass window, low and careful. "What did you say to him?" No response. The inmate just kept staring at the vent. The officer tried again. "What did you tell the man down the hall?" Finally, the inmate moved. A small movement. Barely noticeable. He lifted his head a fraction of an inch. And inhaled deeply. That was it. No words. No smile. No threat. Just a single breath. The lieutenant stepped back. "He's messing with them," the warden whispered. "He wants panic. He wants confusion. This is all part of something." The officers watched the cameras, waiting. For an hour he didn't move again. No words. No strange behavior. Just stillness. This was the eerie calm after the storm. But everyone in the wing knew what came after the calm. The high. And it arrived at 6:03 a.m. The warden had just turned to speak when every monitor in the control room flashed white for a split second. Just a tiny glitch. Barely a blink. But when the picture returned, something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The dangerous inmate, still strapped into the chair, was now sitting with his head turned fully toward the left wall. Not slightly. Not subtly. Completely turned. Like he had twisted his entire upper body without moving his arms or legs. The lieutenant's voice cracked. "Impossible. The straps shouldn't allow that." Before anyone could react, the microphone picked up a faint sound. Not a whisper. Not a word. But a soft, low tapping. Tap, 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 tap. The inmate in cell 3 suddenly leaped to his feet, screaming, "He's knocking. He's knocking something. He's telling me something." Officers bolted toward cell 3. Others raced to the restraint room. Radios exploded with confusion. The warden stared at the monitors, horrified. He's creating panic across the whole wing. He knows exactly what he's doing. The lieutenant grabbed the radio. "Get the tactical team in full gear. Move now." But just as officers reached the door to enter the cell, the tapping stopped. Silence. Dead, heavy silence. The inmate slowly lifted his head and stared directly into the camera with eyes that didn't blink. Then, in the calmest voice they had ever heard from him, soft, steady, chilling, he spoke a single sentence. "You aren't listening to the right person." And Chapter 7 ends right here. With every officer in the isolation block realizing, he wasn't just violent. He wasn't just unpredictable. He wasn't just dangerous. He was influencing the entire wing. Without ever leaving the chair. And the FBI's warning echoed louder than ever. Some inmates are too violent to ever release. Because violence isn't the only thing they control. The officer stood frozen as his words echoed through the isolation wing. "You aren't listening to the right person." A single sentence, delivered in a calm voice that didn't match the chaos it caused. Radios crackled. Boots shuffled. The entire hallway vibrated with a low tension that felt alive. The warden stepped closer to the camera monitor, eyes narrowed, trying to understand. What does he mean? Who is the right person? No one had an answer. The dangerous inmate sat perfectly still in the restraint chair, strapped, locked, monitored, yet somehow holding total control of the environment around him. The other inmates were restless, whispering, pacing, shouting through their doors. Officers tried calming them, but nothing worked. It was him. Even without moving, he was shaping the whole wing. The lieutenant took a deep breath and approached the glass window of the restraint room. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. No reply. Just silence. The inmate's breathing remained slow, even. His stare didn't break. His posture didn't shift. He didn't move a single muscle. But the quiet itself was a message, and everyone felt it. 2 minutes passed. 3, 4. Then came the shift. A faint metallic squeak echoed through the camera feed. Not loud. Not violent. Just enough to freeze every officer in place. The inmate slowly rolled his shoulders, barely an inch but enough to make the chest strap groan against his weight. The lieutenant whispered, "No way. The straps are maxed out. He shouldn't be able to move at all." But he was. Then came another creak. And another. Not enough to break free. But enough to make the officers realize something chilling. He wasn't trying to get loose. He was reminding them he could if he wanted to. For the first time, the warden felt something he hadn't felt in years: fear. He stepped forward. That's enough. He's done influencing this unit. We're moving him to federal black site containment. The lieutenant's eyes widened. That's only for threats to national security. The warden nodded slowly. And that's exactly what he is. A team of 6 elite federal transport officers entered the wing: heavy armor, reinforced shields, shock-resistant gloves, and full-face visors. They didn't speak. They didn't hesitate. They had dealt with the worst of the worst. But even they approached him with caution. They unlocked the door. No movement. They read the extraction order. No movement. They unbolted the restraint chair from the floor. No movement. He let them roll him out of the room, calm, silent, eyes forward. The tension was so thick the hallway felt like it was holding its breath. As they pushed him down the corridor, the inmates in the other cells fell silent too. One by one, loud voices, angry shouts, and nervous whispers faded until the entire isolation block became a graveyard of quiet. Everyone was watching him. Even restrained, rolled in a chair, surrounded by the strongest officers in the prison, he felt like the most in control person in the building. When they reached the final steel gate, the warden stepped forward. He had no words prepared. No speech. No final warning. Just 3 questions pressing in his mind. What is he? How does he do this? And who will stop him if he ever gets out? The officers lifted the chair into the armored transport elevator. The steel door slid shut with a heavy thud that shook the floor. As the elevator locked into place, the audio monitor picked up one final sound. A whisper. Soft. Barely audible. But clear enough to make every officer freeze. It doesn't end here. Then the elevator rose. And he was gone. Hours later, the FBI received the updated file. Another red label was stamped across the front. Permanent federal isolation required. Too violent to release. Too influential to contain. The prison returned to routine. Alarms were reset. Inmates were fed. Guards resumed their posts. But everyone knew the truth. They hadn't removed a problem. They had transferred one. Somewhere deep within a hidden federal facility behind layers of steel, concrete, and secrecy. He now sat alone, in an environment designed specifically for people like him. People the FBI classified as never safe for release under any circumstance. He didn't shout. He didn't fight. He didn't resist. He simply waited. Silent. Still. Watching. Because for a man like him, violence wasn't the real danger. Control was. And even locked away forever, strapped down, buried in a place no one would ever see, he still had it.